Hey everyone, Keto Comet. This one's going to be another tough one. Let's get into it. Ed Graff Jr., Angel Fire Drive. Ed Graff Jr. was born in Texas around 1949. Not much on his background other than he just had an average middle class growing up near Waco, Texas. He did attend college in, I believe, at UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso, though I could be wrong about that. Like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of background on him. But he actually grew up, he was very much interested in finance, was kind of a geek in high school, loved numbers, math, that sort of thing. So he actually ended up, right after college, starting work for the little regional bank of Community State Bank in Texas, where he rose to the rank of vice president. During that time, he met Claire Bradburn, who was a single mom raising two sons, and he met her in 1984. The two got married at the end of 1984, so it was a very, very quick courtship and marriage. He also adopted her two sons, Joby and Jason, which were her sons from her previous marriage, and settled into what Claire described as a perfect middle class existence. She said at first Ed was very loving toward her and the boys. They called him daddy. They really loved him, and it was just idyllic. He had a good job at the bank, and things seemed to be going well until one day he came home and all of a sudden announced that he had resigned from his vice presidency at the bank and had taken a job as a claims adjuster with State Farm Insurance. Claire thought this was strange, but she herself worked as an elementary school teacher, so she said she understood how when you're in a career for a long time, sometimes it can get a little tedious. So she didn't really question the fact that maybe Ed just needed a break. However, later on, she found out that the reason that he left the bank was not of his own choice. He had gotten caught because over the last 12 years at the bank, he had been steadily embezzling money and had taken upwards of about $70,000 from the bank and had gotten caught. To avoid prosecution, he made a deal with the bank saying that he would repay all of that. In return, they would not press charges, nor let it be known what had happened. So, which is very strange. I guess the 80s were just like the Wild West, I suppose, because a lot of the cases we studied that happened in the 80s, a lot of weird things happened. Like, I don't think today you could avoid prosecution after embezzling $70,000 from a bank, and you certainly couldn't avoid getting it on your record, on the public record. But he was able to avoid that by offering to pay back $70,000, which she said that that was just the beginning of their troubles because she noticed that he became very OCD about money, wanted to save every nickel he can. Now, that's not unusual in working class families, but literally yelling at her for not turning off the lights, only wanting to shop with coupons, not wanting to buy the kids new clothes, just things that she seemed very strange, even though he had a good paying job at State Farm as a claims adjuster investigating property damage and property loss. But she said he started to obsess over money, and the reasoning is he had $70,000 to pay back or he was going to go to jail, which all came out a little bit later. Here are the boys, Joby and Jason. Joby was the oldest, and Jason was younger by a year, at 9 and 8, at the time this tragedy took place. Around 1985, I mean exactly 8 or 9 months after they got married, Clara gave birth to Edward Graff III, her and Ed's son. And about the time Edward III was born, she said, along with the financial troubles, he began pushing Joby and Jason away. He would discipline them very stringently, didn't seem to want them around. He and Claire would argue quite extensively. about the boys, about not wanting to put them in Little League, about not wanting to buy them new school clothes, about she wanted to send them to a private school. He vehemently disagreed, said it was too expensive, and he wanted to basically keep them silent. She said he disciplined them to the point that basically he wanted them out of his way. He didn't want to have to deal with them at all, and she said she noticed a change in the boys. Before, they had really loved their stepdad. He did things with them. They enjoyed being around him, but she said in the weeks after their son's birth, after Edward III's birth, she noticed that the boys would their demeanor would change. And whenever Ed walked into the room, or even when Ed called, their demeanor would change. They almost appeared frightened of him. And it really concerned her, and she started speaking with her sister and her mom and telling them what she suspected. And they said that maybe Ed was abusing the boys and she should talk to them about it. She said the boys would never really admit to anything or say anything. They just said they didn't want to get spanked. So it was just kind of a very difficult situation. Well, Claire started to argue with Ed quite a bit about it. That and the whole him being just a penny pincher with money, wanting to control all the money, her paychecks, his paychecks. She couldn't understand where the money was going. So she and he began to argue, and she considered leaving him. She told him that she was going to leave, and he told her that she could do whatever she wanted to do with her sons, but she would never take his son from him, or he would kill her before he allowed that to happen. So, in a stereotypical battered woman or, overpowered woman, she kind of backed off and began silently planning her exit, though not by keeping that out of his ray of vision. She began kind of plotting with her sister Ruby and her mom, kind of silently planning her exit from this marriage. In the meantime, the new school year, 1986-87 school year, was about to start. So her and the boys went school clothes shopping. Ed absolutely had a fit because she spent $50. Now, $50 was probably equivalent to about $110 in today's money, but she bought them $50 worth of new school clothes. She said Ed went ballistic. He told her they couldn't afford that, that was too expensive, and to not let the boys wear the clothes, nor to take the tags off of them. He took the bags, he left the clothes in the bags and placed them in their closet in the master bedroom and refused to let the boys see them or touch them. Now, that was about the last straw for Claire. She began to secretly move clothes out of their house into her mom's house to try to silently stow away so that this wouldn't blow up, but she also thought that was the last straw. In addition, she said Edward had always been very meticulous on keeping their supplies up at the house, groceries, medicines, because the boys had severe allergies. So she said she never had to worry about running out of stuff because Ed was very meticulous about keeping that stuff restocked. Well, she wrote on the list for Ed to pick up at the grocery store the boys' favorite cereal, also to refill Joby's Dimetap prescription. And both of those tasks went undone. He did go grocery shopping. He did not buy the boys' cereal. He went to the pharmacy. He did not refill the boys' prescriptions. Again, she thought that was very strange. She also found that he had taken out life insurance policies on Joby and Jason and Edward III to the tune of about $50,000 each, with a double indemnity for accidental death. And after observing the policies, she discovered that on Joby and Jason, that in the event of an accidental death, they would have paid out somewhere in the neighborhood of $154,000. Now, if you're a mom and you've married a guy who's adopted your kids, and now all of a sudden he seems to hate your children, doesn't want to buy them school clothes, is kind of sort of wanting to erase them from your life or from his life, and then all of a sudden he buys life insurance on them, I might be getting the hell out of Dodge. I don't know what she was thinking. I would have sped up that exit there, but let's move on. August 26, 1986. Claire took the boys to school. She said they shared an unusually long hug in the car before she let them out at school. She immediately went and parked her car. She had already taken Edward the Third over to her mother's to babysit for the day. She dropped the boys at school. She went in and began her day as a teacher. She said it was pretty much a normal average day. After a faculty meeting about 3:30 p.m., she said the principal came into her classroom, and told her she needed to go home immediately. There had been a fire at her house. So immediately she jumped into her car and went over to their residence at 505 Angel Fire Drive in Hewitt, Texas, which is still a suburb of Waco, Texas. And she said that she arrived to literal pandemonium. There were cars lined up and down the street. The entire volunteer fire department was there. First responders were there. People were crying out front. The entire neighborhood was roped off. She immediately ran out of her car towards the house. She said she got into the house. She noticed that the backyard was filled with smoke. Ed was the first person that approached her, and he looked her in the eyes and said, "The boys are gone." And she said, "What do you mean the boys are gone? Where are they?" And he said, "Jason and Joby are dead." She said she didn't want to believe it. She screamed, "What do you mean?" And she immediately broke away from him and ran into the backyard, where she was stopped by the volunteer fire chief, who told her that the storage shed, pictured here, had burned down, and they had found two bodies inside the shed that resembled adolescent males, but they had not yet properly identified them. And she thought it was strange that her husband had already told her that her boys were dead when the bodies had not yet been identified. But unfortunately, after dental records and other things were pulled on the bodies, it did turn out to be the bodies of Joby and Jason Graff. Um, the entire incident was ruled an accident. Um, Edward had said that when he looked out the window, he was in the house with their other young son, who he had picked up from Claire's mother's house, and said that he noticed some haziness out there, but didn't really think much of it until he had neighbors pounding on his door telling him his shed was on fire. He said he immediately ran out. The shed was already engulfed. He really couldn't get up to the shed. He noticed that the door was partially open, but he really couldn't get in there, so he immediately called the fire department. They put the fire out. As you can see, the shed was completely demolished, and the boys were found, both bodies, lying on their back in what the medical examiner termed as a relaxed position. And what he meant by that was it didn't appear to him that there had been a struggle, that the boys had fought against or tried to get away from the flames at all, that they had been in a relaxed position when they died. The volunteer fire department in Hewitt did go up to Ed and offer to take the shed away. They said, "This was a terrible accident. We don't think your wife needs to see the reminder of where her boys died in the backyard. Let's take this shed away and get it out." And he immediately agreed, and the volunteer fire department hauled off the remnants of the shed, and with it, any evidence. Claire said she never bought the fact it was an accident. There was too much strange behavior on Ed's part. There was too many unanswered questions, in her opinion. When they were planning their funeral, she said the final straw for her was that when Ed wanted to bury the boys in the same coffin to quote unquote save money. She said that was his exact word. She said, now, if he had said, "I want to bury them in the same coffin because they were brothers and they were never apart from each other and they loved each other," she said she might have taken it better. But he literally said, "We need to save money. Let's bury them in the same coffin." She said she went ballistic. She knew at that point that Ed had something to do with her son's death. Her mother agreed. Her sister agreed. She immediately took Ed the Third and moved in with her mom. And after Joby and Jason's funeral, they went to the DA, Vic Feasel, and begged him to investigate the accident as a homicide. The DA did review it and found there was some discrepancies that made it look like maybe the boys had been put in there and the fire started, so he decided that he would launch an investigation. He called in 2 fire science experts that reviewed all the information, and according to them, they said it looked as though, from the door being ajar and things like that the boys had been placed inside, and then the fire set in 2 different places with some sort of accelerant. And based on that type of information, purely on the fire science, as well as Ed's strange behavior, because not only had he wanted to bury the boys in the same coffin, he took those school clothes that he had kept in their closet and let the boys wear them or take the tags off of them. He returned those to the store and got his $50 back. And he immediately started to try to cash in on their life insurance, which, with the double indemnity, would pay up to $154,000. All of this, which we have to realize, except for the fire science, which was a little speculative, everything else was circumstantial. His attitude, a bad attitude, being a skinflint, that kind of stuff, it's all circumstantial evidence. Even though I think it made him a horrible person, doesn't necessarily mean he did it. But based on that evidence, he was arrested in late 1986. Again, they contended that he had somehow knocked out the boys, locked them in it, and set it ablaze, mainly because the medical examiner said they were found in a relaxed position and didn't appear to have struggled at all. And they also contended the fire had been locked, though other accounts say that the door was slightly ajar. Late 1987, his trial began in Waco, Texas. The prosecution put forward both the fire science evidence, saying that it looked as though the fire had been started in 2 different places with an accelerant and that the boys had been locked in there, as well as character witnesses for Claire and the boys, saying that they were good boys, the whole 9 yards. The defense centered on the fact that this was all completely circumstantial. When testifying, Ed Graff said that he suspected the boys and some friends had possibly started the fire themselves because he had caught them earlier that month playing with matches and had started a fire in a cup, which he punished them for and said he never told his wife about because he didn't want to worry her. The jury deliberated for exactly 3 hours and sentenced him to life in prison. He was sent to prison, and he remained there until 2009. He exhausted all of his appeals. Again, you have to remember this was still kind of circumstantial, except for the fire science, which was iffy at best. And as a result of that, in 2009, the Innocence Project, which is a Texas nonprofit that wants to make sure that innocent people are not sitting in prison for crimes they didn't commit, actually took up Ed Graff's case, along with about 49 other Texas cases where they felt that arson and murder cases where they felt that faulty fire science had led to false convictions. So in 2009, he was one of 50 cases taken up. They took it before a review board, as well combined of a board of governors, as well as the state fire marshal. And combined with the fact that the fire science was kind of speculative, as well as all the non-objective circumstantial evidence, such as him being a skinflint, not letting the boys take their clothes back, they began to suspect that maybe he was falsely accused. And as a result of the 50 cases, about 40 of them were granted new trials, and Ed Graff was one of them. In 2014, a new trial began in Waco, Texas. New evidence was presented. The prosecution had interviewed friends of the boys that were now, of course, much older, in their 20s, who testified remembering not playing with the boys much that summer, that they had never played with fire, that sort of thing, as well as presenting again the fire science that they had originally put forth, that the shed door was locked and that the boys were found in a relaxed position. So it didn't look as though it was an accidental fire, because they said if it had been an accidental fire, the boys would have struggled and probably not been found in a relaxed position. They also brought in people that had known Ed to testify as to his character and how his demeanor had changed. Among these was a cellmate who was brought in to say that basically Ed had confessed to him in jail that yes, he did kill the boys and he wished he had killed his ex-wife as well, according to this cellmate whose name was Havera, and who he was in prison for arson himself, said that Ed confessed because the cellmate was keeping Ed from getting beaten up. Because I don't know if you know how things are in prison for people that abuse or hurt children. Sometimes their life in prison isn't that pleasant. So they are at risk of being hurt by other prisoners. He said that he kept Ed safe, so Ed shared this with him. That he had not only he told him exactly how he had done it. He said he took the boys out. He put accelerant on cotton balls and hung them around the interior of the shed. He then chloroformed the boys and placed them in the shed and set the fire. He said he'd made sure that they had way more chloroform than they should have, so essentially they were killed with chloroform and not fire, that they didn't suffer, and he simply let them burn away with the rest of the evidence. Now, of course, that's still kind of hearsay, and of course, Ed Graff vehemently denied ever having told Mr. Herrera all this, but that was presented at the case. Take it as you will. Because of the scruples and the speculation put forth by the Innocence Project, originally Ed had been sentenced to life in prison for the capital murders of both boys. However, when the jury was about to be released to go deliberate, Ed suddenly told his attorneys he wanted to plead guilty, and he wanted a plea deal, in which case one was worked out, in which he was sentenced to two 60-year sentences to run concurrently, and pled guilty to the murders of Joby and Jason. But it doesn't end there, y'all, because there was a law on the books in Texas during that time for violent crimes committed between 1977 and 1987. This one got in just under the wire in 1986, that perpetrators of these crimes would be automatically released from jail to alleviate the Texas state overcrowding population in prisons as long as they had served 1/3 of their sentence. Now, Ed before had a life sentence. That was thrown out due to the Innocence Project's intervention, and now he had pled guilty to a 60-year sentence but got credit for time already served because he had already been in jail 30 years for this crime and had served well over 1/3 of that sentence, and therefore he was immediately released. Yeah, that law is no longer in effect in Texas. And that's where it sits today. Ed Graff Jr. has pled guilty to the murder of his stepsons and is in Texas as a free man, working, living. For the first 3 years after his release, he was required to wear an ankle monitoring bracelet. However, that was removed in 2017. And as such, he's working in construction in Kerrville, Texas, a free man with a murder conviction on him. What do you guys think? Personally, I don't know. I think he did it, but there's still a lot of circumstantial evidence here. There was way too much circumstantial evidence presented at the trial. I think this was just a bad trial situation, a bad situation all the way around. But anyway, but he did plead guilty, and so we have to assume that he is guilty, but yet he sits free. And a lot of people believe that he knew about the law and he did what he did as a strategic point, whether he was guilty or not, to get out of prison because he really feared that the jury was again going to return a guilty verdict. So again, what do you guys think? Let me know. Comment below. Hope you enjoyed this. I'm really enjoying the 30 days of Keto Ween. 31 days of Keto Ween. I will be back with more scary stories, more true crime, more reaction videos. Thanks a lot, guys. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Ketosis, y'all. Keto Comic.